Hello, everybody. I'm Robert Flagger for the Kosmos Society, an online community for the exploration and study of the ancient world, guided by traditional classical study, modern online tools, and the ancient Greek world. Membership to the Cosmos Society is by application on our website. It is open to all interested parties. False. Among other learning activities, we offer reading groups, original ancient Greek and Latin works, both in English translation and in original languages. We particularly encourage non-professionals to seek a welcoming environment for learning and discussion. Today, we are here for Cosmos Society's Open House Conversation Series, periodic discussion we hold with interesting leaders in the study of the ancient world. And today, our speaker is Professor Armand D'Angour, and I'd like to share a little bit of information about him. The title of this presentation today is going to be How to Talk About Love, Plato's Symposium. He has a very extensive bio, and from his own website, he describes himself as, quote, I teach Greek and Latin literature at Jesus College, Oxford, where I'm a professor of classics. I research and write about the cultures of ancient Greece and Rome, with a focus on ancient music and Greek and Latin lyric poetry. As I mentioned, he has an extensive bio. He has a very interesting background in classics, music, and business. He's made many contributions to the scholarly study of classics, as well as informing a more popular appreciation of the classical world through his robust engagement with the public. I'd like to draw attention to two of his recent activities. One of them is his book on how to talk about love, which was published quite recently. I think we'll hear a little more about that today. On a podcast that he co-hosts called It's All About Greek and Latin to Me, Topics of Classical Literature. And Professor D'Angour has spoken at the Open House series before. Really appreciate joining us again. And I will turn over the presentation to him.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And hello, everybody. Nice to see some friends. Maria, hello, how are you? um, yes, what I'm going to do is talk about Plato's Symposium, the earliest and perhaps the most famous account of love, or at least discussion of what love may be, though actually what we get in the Symposium, and I'm sure some of you will have read it, is a request by a speaker at a party that the participants in that party say something in praise of Eros. Now, Eros is, of course, the god of love, one of the gods of love in ancient Greek culture, the other being Aphrodite, supposedly the mother of Eros. Eros became Cupid in Roman times, and we all know about the idea of Cupid's arrows. Eros similarly had arrows with which he would wound those who would become the victims of love. And the figure of Eros was therefore considered to be divine, somewhat mischievous divine character. And in some of the earliest literature, which one of the speakers in or in fact, more than one of the speakers in this symposium appeals to, in the earliest literature, he is described, for example, as the earliest of the gods to emerge in, for example, Hesiod's Birth of the Gods, his Theogony. So this is a 7th century literary work in which Eros is described as the earliest of the gods. In other depictions in the time of the Symposium, which was the 5th century BC, Eros was very young. He could be a little child with his bow and arrow. So it's about Eros, and Eros, of course, is where we get the word erotic. And this book, The Symposium by Plato, written in roughly 380 BC, looks back at a time which we can date very precisely to 416 BC. And that is because the setting is a party that takes place a couple of nights after the victory at a tragic at a performance of tragedy uh, by the tragedian Agathon. And he throws a party to celebrate his victory. He's written a tragedy which has got first prize at this festival of Dionysus. And the party he throws gets them all drunk. And the second night, they all return. They say, we're all hungover, so let's not drink. Let's just have a discussion instead. And the first of the speakers, a young man called Phaedrus, says, you know what? Eros has never been praised properly, so let's all talk about Eros love. The result is a series of speeches. Now, what I'm going to do now is share my screen so that I can show you a simplified structure of the symposium. So, can I share? Is there actually a share button? Let me just see if I can do that. Aha, there it is. Right. I hope everyone is going to be able to see this.
Yes, we can see it.
So there's there's a picture of my book, How to Talk About Love. I was specifically asked about the cover, and I chose the pink because I thought that if it's going to be an attractive looking book, then it should have a nice pink cover. And this is a slightly darker pink than the one I was originally given. So there we are. Very aesthetic, this whole production. So in it, I actually translate into very accessible modern English because I think sometimes the translation of this has been a little bit over precise and awkward. I wanted to make it very immediate. And I translate selections of the dialogue by Plato. And I introduce them because I think part of the problem with this wonderful dialogue is that it is a bit culturally alien. I know this because when I was quite young, I read it in Greek and I thought it was absolutely marvelous. When you study something like this, you think, well, wow, that's just wonderful. It's got some great stories and terrific writing. I gave it to a prospective girlfriend who was not a classicist as a kind of Valentine's present. And a few days later, she said to me, I can't make head or tail of it. I just simply don't understand it, which is terribly disappointing to me. So I decided about 50 years later that I'm going to have to translate it in such a way that people will get the same sense of enjoyment and excitement from reading about it. Now, it begins with, as I said, this young man, Phaedrus, in a symposium. A symposium is, of course, a drinking party, literally. This is a drinking party without the drink, hence modern academic symposia, although they tend to have a bit of drink. But in this particular case, they decide not to drink, but to talk. And 5 speeches are given in the first section. So the first section consists of 5 speeches by people sitting around and passing, as it were, the speech from one member to the other, we're told. So Phaedrus begins here. He then passes the speech round. We're told there were various other talkers who we don't remember, so they're not going to be reported. He goes on to a man called Pausanias, who is the older lover of the host of this party in his house it's set, whose name is Agathon. So Pausanias speaks next, and then it should move to the next one who's sitting on the couch next to him. They were arranging couches in these days. Aristophanes, who's the famous comic poet of the 5th century. But Aristophanes has a fit of hiccups. So there's actually some comedy going on within the story. And so Eryximachus, who's a doctor, takes the next speech. He then passes it back to Aristophanes, and then you get Agathon. So that's the first 5 speeches. Then after that, we move to the, as it were, the center of the dialogue, in which Socrates tells us what he learned from a clever woman whom he calls Diotima. She gave him a doctrine about love. And when he finishes his speech, in bursts this young man, Alcibiades. And he gives the third part of this book. It's the longest section in which he describes what love is in the person of Socrates himself. So Alcibiades, as it were, brings us down to earth after Socrates has given us quite a high-flown discussion of what he has learned about love from Diotima. So let's have a look at this then. Very briefly, look at the first five speeches. The young Phaedrus begins by telling us that love is ennobling. It's something that makes us prepared to die. I'm terribly sorry. The- my dog is going mad because the bell has rung. Give me 1 second. Apologies. So, yes, so one has to remember that in ancient Athens of this period, young Athenian men, and Phaedrus is a young aristocrat, were expected to fight in Athens' many battles with its rival city-states. And so Phaedrus is like a young soldier who says, as a lover, I would be prepared to die for the person I love. I wouldn't want to be seen to be doing something shameful by deserting my post or not saving him in battle. And he then draws on certain myths, not just men myths. By the way, this is an all male occasion, but there's quite a lot of femininity in it. And the very first myth he draws on is that of Alcestis, who in Euripides' play, which he would have known, was performed about 20 years earlier, is the heroine who agrees to die on behalf of her husband, Admetus. So Admetus has been told, if you can find someone when you come to die who is prepared to die in your place, then you can live on. So he asks his aging parents if they will do it, and they say, no way. We're enjoying life far too much. And so his wife steps up. I mean, Alcestis said, I'll do it. There's no point in living on without you anyway, she says. She's a very faithful and devoted wife. One of us has to die first, and it might as well be me. So she does that. Luckily, Heracles turns up. He's an old friend of Admetus, and he says, "What's happening?" And Admetus says, "Well, Alcestis has gone down to the underworld." So Heracles, who's one of the heroes who's able to make that descent, says, "Right, I'm going to sort this out." Goes down to the underworld, wrestles with death, and retrieves Alcestis, and brings her back to Admetus, and that's the story. He saves her, but because she has been prepared to die for him, and actually gone down to Hades for her husband, Phaedrus says even that sort of noble behavior is going to be rewarded to the utmost by the gods. And so he uses that as a myth. But it's worth mentioning, though, because he is talking about a woman who's prepared to die for love, not just a man. So the next speaker comes along, so look, says, all very well, love can make a noble person of you, but there are different types of love. There's basically the kind of love that means just chasing after physical sex. And there's true love, which is about commitment and fidelity and really thinking about the psyche, the soul of the person you love. Then the doctor, whose turn comes next after Aristophanes gets his hiccups, changes the mood a bit by making love much more abstract. He says, as a doctor, what I deal with in the body are opposites, hot and cold and wet and dry. And my job is to bring these things into harmony, what we now call the humors, bring the humors of the body into harmony. And that's what medicine's about. And he says, so in a way, being a medic is trying to get to what love is doing in the body. And it's true about music, he says. You have high and low notes, you have fast and slow ones, and you bring them into some sort of harmony and create a lovely piece. And it's true indeed in nature. He says, look at the seasons. You have hot seasons, you have cold seasons and wet seasons. And what we're looking for is some kind of harmonization and balance. And you can see this is always at work, he says. If you have too much hot season, it is then balanced by a wet season and so on. And you can therefore understand how the notion of love is at work in everything. So he's now elevated Eros to a higher plane. Now we come to the most enjoyable speech, I think, the one that everybody remembers, and that is Aristophanes, who says that love is seeking one's other half. And he's very literal about this. He says, this is what we were like originally, a kind of roly-poly duplicate creature, 4 arms, 4 legs. We were so happy with ourselves, so self-satisfied, that Zeus, the chief of the gods, split us in two. Boom. And of course, the first thing that we did when this happened, the original human tried to cling together to the other half. But of course, they couldn't cling together. In fact, what Zeus had done is he'd got Apollo to round us off and put our genitals on the outside and so on. And then one half started to die off. And he says now love is trying to seek that original wholeness that we had. So it's a nice comic myth that Plato puts into Aristophanes' mouth. You know, given that he's a comic poet, it's the kind of thing he might have said, but of course we don't know whether he did. Plato says that this is what he said at the Symposium: love is seeking your other half, which is the kind of thing that people will say. You know, we're looking for someone who will give us a sense of completeness. But actually, Socrates doesn't like that idea. And he will go on to say, look, the problem with finding someone who's your mirror image is you're never going to grow and develop in that relationship. You're going to feel wholly satisfied and complete. But that can't be what love is, because it's just reverting to some kind of narcissistic sense of completion that isn't going to actually make you grow and learn. And anyway, the fifth of the 5 speeches is by the host himself, Agathon, and he gives a kind of rhapsodic. He's a literary person. He's quite camp, I think. You can hear it in the Greek. And he says, love is the source of creativity and the production of beauty. It's the kind of thing that inspires us to produce wonderful works of art like my tragedies. So 5 speeches at the beginning, and it's a bit like that parable of the blind man and the elephant. You know, each of them feel a bit of it. One feels the trunk and says an elephant's like a snake. The other one feels the side and says an elephant's like a wall. Clearly, they're all very partial. And what we're looking for is something that will pull all these things together. And effectively, that's what the next section, section 2, does, which is Diotimus' doctrine as reported by Socrates. And Diotima, he says, very clever woman. Amongst other things, she postponed the plague of Athens, 430 to 29, by 10 years. Very strange and interesting comment to make about this supposedly fictional person. And he says that Diotima, who he said, I used to attend her talks on more than one occasion, once upon a time when I was a young man, effectively. He says she used to say that love begins with attraction to another body. And then you realize that the attraction that you have to that body is because of the beauty in that body, what you find beautiful in that body, and that beauty is to be found in lots of bodies. So you then discover you're attracted to the beautiful thing in a lot of other bodies. And then you realize that actually that beauty can be found not just in physical human beings, but in greater things such as your country, the love of your love of wisdom, the love of the law, the love of things of that kind. And then she says, and there's an interesting point at which she says, you know, up to this point, even you, Socrates, can understand what I'm talking about. But now I'm going to initiate you into a deeper mystery. And she talks about love as, you know, the lesser mysteries are now the greater mystery. And the greater mystery is that as one proceeds up what she then calls the ladder of love, rung by rung, you discover that you leave behind the love of physical bodies, of physical objects, of the world itself, and you realize that what you are aiming for is the love of beauty and goodness itself. In fact, the word in Greek, to kalon, is the same for the beautiful and the good. But you are looking for what beauty is itself. And on the way, she defines love as giving birth in relation to beauty. So the idea is that what love does is inspires you to be creative, giving it, you know, she says the lover is pregnant either in body or soul and wants to give birth. Of course, if you're a pregnant woman, you'll give birth to a human being in order to perpetuate yourself, which is what Socrates claims, or Diotima claims, is what you want to do. If you love, you want to love and not have that love come to an end. You want continuity. So that perpetuity can be attained in some way by giving birth to a child, or by giving birth in relation to what is beautiful, which may be thinking and thought and ideas, something creative in terms of writing or in terms of ideas. So this allows for both homosexual and heterosexual love in a way, because even homosexual lovers can give birth to beauty in relation to what they see as beautiful in the other person. So that's her doctrine. It's very high flow and ends up with this idea of the vision of truth and goodness, the transcendent vision. And at that point, Alcibiades bursts in. He's a well-known character from the 5th century BC. He was a general, he was a statesman, he was a playboy, and a very dangerous character. And in fact, a year after this is set, so this is set in 416, a year after in 415, he, as a general, promoted the notion that Sicily should be conquered by the Athenians. Sicily had this great city of Syracuse, which was rich and populous and very potentially a rival to Athens. And he suggested that the Athenians needed to conquer Syracuse, and they voted to do that, and they set off on a huge expedition. But the night that it sailed, he was discovered to have done something sacrilegious, and so they recalled him. He fled into exile, went to the enemy, and helped to engineer a terrible defeat. A few years later, the worst defeat in the so-called Peloponnesian War. So he became a traitor to Athens. But at this stage, he's this young man who is beloved of Socrates. They shared a tent together when he was 19 and Socrates was 37. They went to war together. They fought on campaign. Socrates is made to say that he loved Alcibiades more than any other man. He was probably his teacher and his mentor. And Alcibiades talks about how when they were on campaign, he said, you know, I was so in love with Socrates that I wanted him to sleep with me. But he wouldn't. And this is absurd because Alcibiades is supposedly the most handsome young man of the day. And Socrates is not interested. Why? Because he's a lover of the soul rather than the body. Alcibiades talks of him as being a brave and strong soldier. So you can see how that reprises what Phaedrus has said about love. He's a lover of the soul rather than the body. So he is working towards something that is more transcendent than purely physical. So that goes back to Diotimus' speech and to some extent to the doctor's speech. You know, love is something much greater and a harmonizing element. And he's also a mysterious man with internal rather than external beauty. So something about Socrates relates to the beauty that we have heard about from Diotima. So that is the last speech. That is the last section. And as I say, the longest section of this amazing dialogue. And one might well ask, what does Plato want to leave us with in terms of our understanding of love? Because he's had Socrates say, I'm going to tell you the truth about love. In fact, Socrates here in this section has said, look, we've all had different views about love and, you know, they're entertaining and they're partial. But what I'm going to tell you is the truth about love. And that's a very curious thing for Socrates to say, because famously he said, the one thing I know is I know nothing. So how come he does know something that is the truth about love, and he's prepared to say it? The answer is because I learned it from a very clever woman. So it's not his own truth, as it were. It's the truth that he learned, but he is prepared to claim is true. And it's this doctrine that love starts with physical attraction, moves up the ladder until you get to the Platonic idea, i.e., Plato's own doctrine, is what interrupts this speech. In a sense, it comes to its finale with something that Socrates couldn't possibly have said himself, and nor could anybody he learned about love from, because it's only the developed doctrine of Plato in the 4th century BC where we have this notion of the idea, the transcendent idea of beauty and truth. And that explains beautifully why Diotima says, up until this point, Socrates, even you can understand the mystery. So Socrates can understand that love is not just physical, It's not just a love of the beauty that is in bodies, it's also the love that you can attach to your city or to wisdom or to justice. All of that he can understand. Beyond that, it's the transcendent idea. So it's almost as if Plato is telling us this is what Socrates actually learned from this clever woman, and this is what he should have learned, because it's what I think is the right explanation of truth, goodness, beauty, and love. That is the Platonic idea. Now, I say that there's this two-part initiation into the mystery of love because I do believe that the clever woman spoken of by Socrates, and some will you know because I wrote a book, Socrates in Love, 2019, I believe that we can identify her as the beloved wife of Pericles, the leading citizen of Athens, who was called Aspasia of Miletus. And Aspasia came from Miletus in Asia Minor, in Ionia, a very big Greek city on the coast there, to Athens when she was a young woman, probably roughly the same age of Socrates. And amazingly, we're told by an independent source that she set up salons in which she talked about love. And she talked about love as something that required ethical engagement. Now, this sounds very like the kind of thing that Dharma's lesser mysteries are talking about. Love is not just about the body, it's about some kind of ethical understanding of something greater than you, something that has a beauty in it, such as wisdom and justice and law. And that, I think, can be then attributed to Aspasia's own doctrine that Socrates, we're told, actually heard. The other, I have two proofs which amazingly have never been discovered from the text of the Symposium. One is the name itself. So Diotima, honored by Zeus, is what it means in Greek, Diotima. And Zeus, in the mouth of a comic poet like Aristophanes, would have meant one thing to an ancient reader, and that was Pericles. Because the comic poets of the time, and we know of them, Cratinus and Eupolis, and we have their fragments, and they're always lampooning Pericles as being a kind of thundering god like Zeus himself. And they call him Zeus, and they actually call his wife Hera. So Zeus and Hera are Pericles and Aspasia. So the very fact that Aristophanes is made to give a talk in which he talks about a character called Zeus splitting the original human beings in half, I think is a very convenient way of Plato saying this woman is modeled on Aspasia, the woman who was famously honored by Pericles, i.e. Zeus, more than any other woman. So we're told in Plutarch that Pericles actually embraced Aspasia in public, and this was extraordinary. He gave her undue respect. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, as I mentioned, when he introduces her, he said she was a clever woman. And amongst other things, she managed to postpone the plague at Athens. Well, the plague happened in 430 to 29 BC, and Pericles died from it. She postponed it by 10 years, apparently. So why should it have happened 10 years earlier? The reason is very clear, because any historian knows that what happened in 440 to 30 was that Pericles conquered the island of Samos, and he threw out the bodies of the commanders of the other side without burial. And that was the kind of thing that the ancient Greeks thought should result in divine retribution, because it was a very sacrilegious act. You had to bury your enemy. At this very time, Sophocles, who was a general, that is the playwright, who was a general on Samos, wrote his Antigone. And the Antigone is all about the divine requirement to bury your enemy. In this case, it's her brother Polynices. And the chorus there talk about the plague that will result if there's no burial. So there should have been a plague in 440 to 439 after Pericles conquered the island of Samos and threw out the bodies. But if we take this comment seriously, a clever woman arranged for sacrifices which resulted in the plague not happening at that time. Now, maybe people thought it had been completely averted, but when it happened 10 years later, and Pericles died from it, they must have thought, oh, well, it had been postponed. It had been postponed by 10 years, and the reason for that postponement was the sacrifices that had been arranged by a clever woman. Well, there is only one clever woman in the picture. At that stage, Aspasia and Pericles had been married for 5 years, and she was exceptionally clever by all accounts. Plato has another dialogue, the Menexenus, in which Aspasia is given to us by name as the eloquent teacher of Socrates, and she teaches him a funeral speech which she says she previously taught Pericles. So we have to believe that she actually created the famous funeral speech given by Pericles and reported by Thucydides. And what is quite amazing is that in the Menexenus, the speech that Aspasia teaches Socrates has certain particles in Greek in an unusual combination, which are found nowhere else in Greek apart from in the funeral speech as reported by Thucydides. So there's clearly a link between Aspasia and the funeral speech of Pericles. So she's this clever woman in Plato. She's a clever woman in Xenophon, where Socrates says, I'll introduce you to Aspasia, he says to a friend, because she can teach you all about these things, all sorts of things. She's very clever. Nobody else would have been in a position to, or be interested in trying to avert some potential plague in 439. And so Plato has given us a very clear date and a very clear name. And I think this is important for all kinds of reasons. My book on Socrates in Love ends by suggesting that if it's true that she then taught Socrates his method, she taught him the method of definition, because she asked for a definition of love, diotima, and she taught him the method of moving from the particular to the general. And those two elements are the only thing Aristotle tells us Socrates was interested in. Those two methods. His examination of the truth by seeking a definition and by moving from particular examples to general definitions. And it's amazing because if indeed Socrates is to be believed when he says, this woman taught me all I know about love, she also taught him the Socratic method that becomes known as his, and that leads to what might be called the foundational moment of Western philosophy. We should probably push that back to to Aspasia, and there is other independent evidence that she was beloved of him, because we have a pupil of Aristotle telling us that before Aspasia was with Pericles, she was with Socrates. So that's all a biographical background, but I think it leads to some interesting philosophical ramifications as well. So that's your symposium. That's briefly what is said about love. The question remains, are we to take this central doctrine as the truth about love, or are we to take the typical ancient Greek structure whereby the last speaker has the last word on any subject? So what you get very often is a debate in which you have A, B, and C speaking, as in Herodotus's debate in Book 3 of his histories, talking about what kind of constitution the Persians should have. The last speaker is the one whose opinion counts. So are we saying then that Alcibiades' speech is the one whose opinion should count? Love isn't about this transcendent ladder of love leading to the Platonic idea, but it's about who you love. It's about embodying these feelings that may or may not be worked out in physical sexual engagements with somebody who you find worthy of love. I think that's likely to be the case. I think the reason that Plato finishes with this very long and very loving personal speech by Alcibiades is because he wants his reader to recognize what love really is. And it isn't for most people something to do with a transcendent view of beauty and wisdom. It is about finding in the person you love the things that are worthy of that love. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank our speaker. Thank you very much. All right, I'd like to open the floor questions, but I want to Before I do that, things organized here for just a minute. Okay. All right. Um, yeah, if you're interested in asking questions, I'm going to ask the first question as the host along. But if you're interested in asking questions, use a visual signal or the little um, hand raise symbol, please. So yes, I have a I have a lot of questions, but just one I wanted to ask. My background is not as strong, let's say, as some of the other people here, but do you, I mean, on the topic of Plato, Plato's Symposium, I'm sorry. Do you think the symposium actually took place, or is it a fictional setting that Plato?
Of course, there would have been a lot of symposia. It was a standard thing for elite Athenians to do. They met in parties. They normally had piper women called auletrides, sometimes translated as flute girls, but they didn't play flutes, they played pipes, and they weren't girls, they were women. These were slaves, and they would accompany the party with music, which could have been both background music, or if the participants wanted to sing something that was accompanied, they would be able to accompany them. In this particular case, those letrides are sent away so that the participants can actually speak. Um, and I mean, that's another indication of, as it were, women that are in the background but not actually present. Yes, there were lots of symposia going on. This particular one is surely fictional. And one of the reasons we can probably agree to that is that even the way Plato sets up the symposium is to distance it as far as possible. What he does is he's putting the whole of the dialogue into the mouth of a man called Apollodorus, who said that he had heard about the symposium from a report by another man called Aristodemus, who was there, to Plato's brother Glaucon. So it's like there are so many bits of distance here. You know, I heard it from him and he was there, but he reported it to him. And that's what I'm telling you. And this is what he said, according to Plato's brother. So there's no way that we are expected to take this as a literal report of what went on at that symposium in 416 BC. And the way it is created as a literary artifact, I think, with these three sections and the eruption of Alcibiades, makes it very clear, I think, again, that Plato is creating a great work of literature that we're meant to take away and think about philosophically.
That's good. You'll have to
Thank
unmute
you.
yourself.
Thank you. I would appreciate if you could elaborate on the birth of Eros as an offspring of Poros and Penia, and especially at the time of conception, while, Poros is the male sleeping while Penia comes to him, and, the contrapositions and poverty and plentiness. And if that implies that love is always a lacking and a fulfillment, a battle between them. And I'm really interested because Jacques Lacan, talks Paritoire du désir and talks a lot about it.
Yes, yes. So I didn't go into that, but the standard mythology of Eros is that he's the son of Aphrodite, but that would make him divine. And the problem with being divine, according to Socrates or Diotima, is that you have everything you need. And if you've got everything you need, you therefore aren't going to have any desire. And if you don't have desire, then you don't really have love. So he didn't want, just as Aristophanes, roly-poly man, has everything they need, they've got, as it were, both sides with them. They have that original wholeness. So similarly, divinity is not lacking, but love requires you to feel a lack so that you can try and fulfill it. So there's the difference between, that's why he objects to Aristophanes' picture, because if you don't have a lack, you're not going to go anywhere. So what he does, he creates, or Diotima creates, this other myth. He says actually the parentage of Eros was, as you say, plentifulness, poros, and poverty. So these two personified characters, someone who has a lot of everything and someone who has very little, create a composite being who he calls a daimon, which is a spirit rather than a god, who can understand that there are both these aspects to the notion of love. On the one hand, there's the recognition that there's a potentially fulfilling bit, the poros. There's a recognition that you are lacking in something that you need to fill. And so it's a sort of allegorical description of the idea of love having a lack that it needs to fill by constantly seeking and using the desire to get it to a place where it hasn't been before. So it allows for what we might call personal growth. And that's why he invents this myth of resourcefulness and poverty being the parents of Cupid. Does that help? I mean, one other thing I should say is that Socrates always said, I am a philosopher, which means I am a lover of wisdom, philosophos. So philos, I love Sophia. I am not someone who knows. I am not sophos. I'm not a wise person. And the reason I'm a philosophos is because I am not wise. If I were, I wouldn't be seeking wisdom. So that's very much part of what's going on here. Seeking wisdom, seeking the truth, seeking the knowledge of the truth that Plato says is ultimately what lovers seek. That is what a philosopher is trying to do. And that is what a lover is trying to do.
Thank you.
Bill has now raised.
Hi, I very much liked Socrates in Love. My question today has to do with the order of speakers. Assuming that the piece was composed to make a point, besides comic effect, what's the purpose of the hiccups?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there are various possible answers to that. So what the hiccups does is, if you imagine that the speeches had been Phaedrus, Pausanias, Aristophanes, which is what it originally should have been, then what you would get is an interruption into what you might call an attempt to analyze aspects of Eros. So in a way, Phaedrus is analytic. He's saying, you know, you'll die for love, therefore it's something that ennobles you. Pausanias literally picks up on Phaedrus and says, yeah, but it's not just something that makes you noble. A lot of love, bad love, is pretty disreputable. It makes you chase after bodies. And we therefore want to talk about good love. If you then had immediately after that Socrates speech in which he would say create a funny story about the two sides, it would, I think, have left the following speeches slightly in limbo. Whereas actually we can see a bit of a progression with the next speech, which begins to elevate the notion of love to something higher. So there are all kinds of possible literary reasons, but I think that's what you say about it being for comic effect is also one that is probably quite important to Plato. He wants to say, I can write comedy and I can write tragedy. And what you get is a juxtaposition in Aristophanes and Agathon between the comedian and the tragedian. I mean, you could say, well, why is Agathon's speech tragic? I mean, is he really talking about anything that involves what we might call tragedy? Well, the answer is actually he's talking about the creation of a literary work and the creation of art. So in that sense, he is. But you might say, well, surely Aristophanes has also done that. So, I mean, there are lots of different considerations here, but I think that the main one probably is something to do with the progression of ideas.
Thank you.
Thanks, William.
Study, please.
Yes, thank you very much. May I come back to your last point, which is Alcibiades' theory? And I think, if I remember correctly, you said love is trying to identify in the other person what makes them worthy of that love. But isn't it a way of coming back to oneself? Because if you're trying to identify in the other person what makes them worthy of my love, it's a way of coming back to oneself, isn't it?
Well, I'm sure there's a sort of interdependence there. After all, a relationship between two people does require an interconnection. So it's not one way. It's always going to be a two-way thing. And Alcibiades seeking in Socrates, or telling us what he found extremely lovable in Socrates, is to some degree also telling us what he finds lovable generally, and therefore is the kind of thing that he would aspire to as a human being. So, I mean, if you find, for example, courage and self-restraint, which is what he praises in Socrates, lovable, what it means is that he has learned that those qualities are things that he should love in himself and should cultivate in himself. And that's, somewhat ironic because, of course, Alcibiades was famously, although he was very brave, he was also unself-restrained. He was a bit of a playboy, and he went on to do things that Socrates would certainly not have approved of. But he makes the point that whenever he strayed from Socrates' presence, he became less good. So I think Plato wants us to know that it's not because of Socrates, but it's despite Socrates that Alcibiades turned out who he was. But I agree with you that there has to be some identification with oneself. I would go further, and those of you who know my book Socrates' Love will see that I actually designate Alcibiades as an alter ego of Socrates, another self. I mean, in a way, Alcibiades, a young, handsome soldier who gets glory in battle, is what the young Socrates would have wanted to be. And I think there is a lot of connections between the two in that way. Socrates is made to say that he loved no one else the way he loved Alcibiades, and Alcibiades is made to say he loved Socrates so much he would have wanted him to have physical sex with him. So, they have got something going there. But it is a good point. What is going on? I think the point Alcibiades leaves us with is that he finds in a real person the qualities that all the other speakers, including Diotima, have spoken about as being the thing that makes love tick.
Thank you.
I do have a question. You were saying that Aspasia actually taught Socrates the Socratic method, and afterwards she's not really praised for that by Plato and others. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is obviously going to be very controversial, but inevitably, in a highly patriarchal society, an exceptional woman is going to be the object of a lot of negative comment. That was certainly the case with Aspasia. So what we learn, amazingly, from Plato and Xenophon is that she was a teacher, an instructor of eloquence, a very clever woman, someone who was highly respected and highly loved by the leading citizen of Athens. We learn all of that from Xenophon's Memorabilia, from Plato's Menexenus. But what we learn from the comic poets, who are the other main source of evidence from that period, is that she was a prostitute and that she kept a brothel, and that the reason Pericles went to war on Samos was because Aspasia wanted to get her own city-state of Miletus to beat down Samos, which was a commercial and political rival, and that she initiated the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC because some Megarians, so Peloponnesians, had stolen 2 of her prostitutes from the brothel that she kept while she was married to Pericles for 16 years. You know, the absurdity is there. So what I say is, really, we have to take our pick. Either she was a respected and honored teacher, as the sober biographer and historian and philosopher Plato and Xenophon, as they tell us, or we believe what the comic poets say, and that she was a prostitute, a common prostitute, a porne, and that she kept a brothel, and that she was worried about some of her prostitutes running away, and as a result went to war. Now, to me, there is no choice between those two. It's clear that the comic poets are just indulging in comic slander. And actually, what is amazing is that so many historians over the years would say, well, she was a prostitute and she kept, she was probably a madam, and yet she somehow lived with the leading citizen of Athens. I mean, how could they have come to that view? Quite a few in the last couple of centuries decided that's so patently absurd that instead they would call her a hetaira. Nice solution. Famously a hetaira, an upper-class courtesan, the kind of woman who entertains elite men, maybe a little bit of hanky-panky, but basically she's just a very entertaining, clever woman, a Madame la Pompadour. And it became so commonplace to call her a hetaira. I grew up with this historical view that this is what she was, a courtesan. And when I started looking at the sources, I couldn't believe there was not a single ancient source. Dozens and dozens of comments about her, both in Plato and Xenophon, the comic poets, in Cicero, in other sources. Not a single one uses that term of her, when it would have been so easy for an ancient author to say she was a hetaira. But they don't, because she wasn't. So forget the middle ground. You have the extremes. If you have the extremes, you have to make a decision. Take your pick. For me, she was a clever woman who was reviled. And one of the reasons I think that Plato couldn't make her central to the Socratic method in the way that I'm suggesting she probably was because he knew that the people who read his Symposium would find it unacceptable that someone who they had grown up hearing about in such negative terms actually was a really clever woman and someone who had influenced Socrates in his philosophy. So that is clearly a good reason why he couldn't say that. He could say it in the Menexenus, and various reasons why it was possible to say Aspasia helped to write the funeral speech, even though a lot of scholars have dismissed that as a joke. I mean, scholars are extremely partial. They decide what they want to take as historical and what they want to take as humorous. I take the Menexenus as a serious indication that Aspasia did help Pericles write the funeral speech, possibly even wrote it for him. And I found evidence within that speech, not just the little particles, that it has her hand. But you can just see why Thucydides, the historian, didn't say, here's a speech Pericles gave, which had been written for him by his prostitute wife Aspasia. It wouldn't have worked. And it wouldn't have worked for Plato to say something about Aspasia giving this very wise, clever, and very philosophical account of love, which he then went on to foist his own ideas onto, because that was the other problem. She's not Aspasia, first of all, because the greater mysteries are Plato's ideas. They're not Aspasia's. But secondly, because even the earlier mysteries, the idea that love is something greater and that you have to seek a definition and so on, well, they might as well be Socrates, because that's what he went on to make his life's work. His life's philosophy was espousing the method that we first see, I think, in Diotima's doctrine of love. So lots of reasons there, but it does mean a very radical rethink if we are to believe the evidence that I have adduced for Diotima being at least a modeled on a real woman, Aspasia. So thank you for that question.
Right. So we just have time for one more question, and George has been patiently waiting.
Thank you. That was a really, really great lecture. Appreciate it. Would you comment on the effect of the distancing that occurs with this reported symposium that was told to the next guy and reported again? How does that function within the bigger picture?
So once it's set up, we don't really hear any more of it. A lot of the Bye, Jack. A lot of the dialogue is written as if Apollodorus is still speaking. So there's a particular construction, accusative and infinitive construction. He said that, blah, and then he said that. Now, when you translate it, you can't keep on using that, but that is what Apollodorus is saying. And then Aristodemus said that the next speaker. So what I've done is I've missed out a lot of those and just said the next speaker was. But so it does continue throughout the dialogue, this notion that this is being reported at a distance from the original event. It doesn't end with Apollodorus saying, well, that is what I heard. And that it doesn't end like that. It just tails off with the scenario of Socrates and Aristophanes drinking till the early hours of the morning and discussing the question of whether the same person can write tragedy and comedy, which is kind of an interesting coda. So essentially, it's a distancing thing from at the beginning. And once you've got that distance, it just stays at that distance from us.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to have to bring it to a close. I know there's a couple other questions in the chat box. I really appreciate your willingness to speak to us, Professor. Thank you so much for the interesting talk. And let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you all very much, and thanks for the interesting questions. So there are a couple of questions in the chat, which I will answer in the chat, if I may. You can pass them on.
Okay.
Bye for now.